here are the things that I would focus on if I wanted to adopt a British accent fast. Hi, my name is Nisreen. I'm a speech and language therapist, a linguist, and a TEFL trained teacher. And today I want to share with you what are the key things in a native British speaker's accent that are important to focus on if you want to adopt this way of speaking. I'm going to split this video into two main parts. The first part focusing on the micro elements of the British accent, being the sounds such as the vowel sounds, consonant sounds, and some phonological processes. And then the second part, I'll focus on more the macro elements of British English, like the stress patterns, intonation, etc. I want to preface this with my focus being on the received pronunciation, the RP British accent, which is predominantly spoken in the south of England. So there are lots of different accents in the UK, but this is the one that I'm going to be focusing on. So the first thing that distinguishes accents in general, whether that's within the UK or between different types of native English speakers like American or Australian, is the vowel sounds. That would be my first go-to if I was to be working with a client to try and help them in sounding more like a native speaker. The reason for this is there is distinct patterns in English. The first vowel that I would completely be practicing and honing on is that schwa sound. The schwa sound in British English is used so much, it'd be silly not to use that one first. And it's a very simple vowel. Anyone can pronounce it, and you just softly open your mouth halfway and just go So it's a very simple, very neutral sounding vowel that we use often. There are approximately 20 different vowel sounds in British English. 12 of those are monophthongs, which just means a singular vowel, and 8 of those are diphthongs, which are two vowels together. For example, in the word ear, ear, ear. So there's two vowels next to each other, so that's a diphthong. One of the cool things about learning the schwa when you practice British English is that it automatically corrects the stress patterns within a word. So for example, if you take the word computer, computer, where is the stress in that word? It's in the middle of the word. Computer. Pu is the stressed syllable. And the first syllable and the last syllable are actually unstressed and they have a schwa in them. Computer. Computer. When you adopt the schwa correctly, you will automatically start adopting the correct stress patterns in English. When a schwa is in a syllable, it is 99% of the time unstressed. It's not a stressed sound. And many words, not just content words like nouns and verbs, have the schwa, but the in-between function words also often have the schwa. So for example, if you were saying, he was going to the shop, he was going to the shop, was, to, the, all have the schwa sound, and they're all unstressed in that sentence. He was going to the shop. Again, the schwa sound helps you to have correct syllable stress patterns within words, but also within sentences. Words ending in shun, whether that's S-I-O-N or T-I-O-N, will have that schwa sound in it. Examples of words are things like information, presentation, complication. The next group is words ending in AL. So for example, professional, global, personal. These words that end in that AL, again, end with that schwa. Other words that end in OUS also carry that schwa sound and are unstressed. So for example, ambitious, generous, continuous. Another pattern is words that end with END or EN. For example, husband, hidden, legend. So these words also end in that schwa sound, and that last syllable is unstressed. As you can see, there are lots and lots of English words that will have that schwa sound, and words in the sentence, such as those small words, function words like a, the, to, for to, will have that schwa sound. The second vowel that I would focus on when it comes to British English in particular is the O sound. So this is a sound that is often used in British English in words like stop, hot, body. We use it a lot, and it distinguishes British English from, for example, American English, where they actually open their mouth more. It's wider, less rounded than when the Brits say it. For example, instead of stop, they would say stop. They don't round their lips as much, and it's not as short as a vowel as it is in British English. So it distinguishes you from the American way of speaking and is a very British way of speaking with that vowel. The third vowel that I would focus on practicing with a client is the R sound. So this is the long stretched out R, like in car or heart. So notice that this replaces actually pronouncing the R in those words. For example, in American English or even the Irish accent, they would say park, car. But in British English, we don't say that R. So instead, what we do is we stretch out that vowel. Car, park, heart, hard. So this is very characteristic of British English. And again, if you pronounce it this way, people will know that you sound more like a British speaker. What's important to note is that the reason that we don't pronounce the R is that there is a phonological rule in which when the R is followed by a consonant, we don't pronounce the R sound. When the R is followed by a vowel, we actually do pronounce that vowel sound, which we'll go on to next. So when it comes to consonants, one of the first consonants that I would teach someone is that linking R sound. So in English, sometimes we say our R's, sometimes we don't. And as I mentioned before, when it's followed by a consonant, we often don't say the R sound. However, when it's followed by a vowel, we will pronounce that R sound. For example, if I was to say the sentence, he went for a drink. He went for a drink, for a drink. So the for ends with an R, and you actually pronounce that R because following it is the sound, that schwa sound, for a drink. So this is very common in English where we do pronounce that R sound, and it's called the linking R. A few more examples. If I was to say, the new car is expensive. The new car is expensive. Car is expensive. So the R sound in car, and then following is that vowel sound, so you pronounce the R sound. It's very subtle, it's very soft, it's not very strong, but it is still there. You can also have it within words. So for example, it was very cold. It was very cold. And also in words with clusters. She was crying out loud. She was crying out loud. Other words with clusters like bright, stripe, these words also the R is pronounced. The next consonant sound that I would focus on when teaching British English accent is the TH sound. So whether that be the voiceless sound, th, or the voiced version, the, I would focus on practicing that. And partly because a lot of languages actually don't have this sound, and a lot of people will struggle to produce it. But in English, we use it a lot. So for example, we have a lot of function words that have this sound in it, such as the, that, these, though, this, and even the voiceless version, such as think, thank you, third, we use it a lot. So it's a good sound to practice and to really master to help you sound more British. Part of the pattern that I see with non-native English speakers, because they don't have this sound in their language, they will replace it with a sound that they do have. For example, TH will often become T, like thank you. Or they will replace it with S, like thank you, instead. Now looking more at the macro elements of speech, I would look at things like intonation. So intonation is in all languages. I think every language pretty much has some intonation pattern, and it's what I call the spice of language or the spice of speech. It really helps to understand a person better when you know the intonation of their speech. It can reveal if they're sad, angry, a lot of emotion with intonation. So it's a really helpful skill to have, and also to understand the patterns that we have in British English. Now, there are a few different patterns in English, but I'm going to focus on the two common ones, and that is the statement pattern of intonation and the question pattern of intonation. With a statement, the intonation starts with a fairly neutral sound and then falls down at the end. So for example, if I was to say, "You're going out tonight," "You're going out tonight." So it rises a little bit, but then it falls right back down because it indicates that it's the end of the sentence. So that's a very common intonation pattern, and it's for regular statements that we use at the end of a sentence, like this. However, sometimes you can take that same statement and make it into a question. So for example, you could say, "You're going out tonight," "You're going out tonight," and that will indicate that you're actually asking the person if they're going out tonight. The intonation gives an idea to the person what it is you want from them in terms of the speech, in terms of the communication, in terms of the messaging. These two are the key ones. There are others, as I mentioned, but I won't go through them in this video. But the key one is if it's a statement, you want to fall down with the intonation at the end, or if it's a question, you want to rise at the end. Interestingly, if you're asking a WH question, so for example, "When are you going out tonight?" it actually ends on a fall. It doesn't end on a high intonation like with the statement turned into a question. So it's just something to bear in mind. I don't want to go too much into intonation, but it is an interesting area and definitely something that can help you sound more like a native speaker. Stress and rhythm patterns in British English will really help you to sound more like a native speaker quite quickly. And the reason being is that English is a stress-timed language. Unlike other languages, such as Japanese, for example, where the stress patterns are equal, in English, British English and American English as well, is that the stress patterns are not equal. There is variation depending on what you're saying, and this can really help the listener to understand you more easily. If you have equal stress, it's actually quite difficult for the person to understand you, and you sound quite robotic to them. So stress patterns and rhythm is a really useful skill to know how to use when you're speaking in English. And when English is a stress time language, there are two areas to look at. There is stress within a word, so word stress, and then there's stress within sentences, so sentence stress. So within a word, you want to think about, for example, where is that schwa sound? Because that is ultimately going to be reduced stress. It's not going to be a stressed syllable. And there are patterns within words that you can think about when trying to master the stress patterns in English. For example, when you have nouns or adjectives, the stress patterns are often on the first syllable. For example, table, window, clever, doctor, happy, quiet, common. So these words all have the stress on that first syllable. So this is in two-syllable words. When it comes to verbs, the stress is often on that second syllable when it's a two-syllable word. So for example, to relax, to begin, to explain, to admit. So the stress is on that second syllable. When it comes to multisyllabic words, it gets a little bit more tricky. I won't go into that in this video, but you can at least say for two-syllable words, that is the main stress patterns that you will see. The second tip when it comes to stress is if there is a prefix, that prefix will not be stressed. So for example, unhappy, discomfort, unfair, return, dislike. So the prefix isn't going to be stressed. However, suffixes, so added words at the end, can attract stress. So for example, if you said employee, the E is stressed. Employee, trainee, Japanese, Lebanese, that can attract the stress to be on that last syllable, the suffix. Another one is engineer, volunteer. So sometimes the suffix can attract stress. These are just 2 patterns of stress. There are others, like I said, with multi-syllables, like 3 syllables or more. There are other patterns at play, but if we're trying to teach British English pronunciation quickly, these are the 2 that I would focus on. There are other tips when it comes to trying to adopt a British accent, and it can be down to not just how you sound, but the words that you use. For example, there are lots of words that are American English that we don't really use in British English, even though we understand them. So, for example, trash instead of rubbish, pavement instead of sidewalk, etc. So there are words that are different, but this is more focusing on the sound patterns in British English. I hope this video has been helpful in some way in just getting you started with understanding the main features of British English. If it was helpful, let me know in the comments. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.